So when the DLC was announced, we saw the familiar sight of the jars in the trailer and thought, oh yay, I'm ready for some jar lore. No, you're not. I was genuinely aghast by what emerged from one of these jars. I didn't see this coming. So let's give some context. There's an underground area called Belurat Jail. Belurat is a settlement tied to one of the new factions, for lack of a better word, called the Horn Scent, and the term jail means that it's in a prison beneath the city. When you first arrive, you find cages scattered around, typical for a jail, but as you reach the end of the tunnel, you're met with one of those classic FromSoft vistas, a vast, cold chamber with an eerie blue glow, and the familiar jars hanging ominously from chains over a deep chasm. There's a chill in the air, strangely quiet. The once friendly pots are still. Something is not right here. As you move further in, you stumble across a ghost. Please, not jar. Anything but that. I promise I won't ever do it again. The final moments of a spirit begging not to be subjected to the jar. Until now, the base game jars have been portrayed as almost whimsical, animated, and beloved by many. Alexander, for example, is a notable living jar. His questline is about his goal to become a great warrior. To do so, he collects the bodies of fallen warriors and stores them within himself.
I was created to be a warrior vessel. Many great warriors reside within me, ever dreaming of becoming a great champion.
But Alexander isn't a villain, he's more of an opportunist. For example, after the Redown Festival, you can find Alexander collecting the bodies of fallen warriors from the battlefield and adding them to his collection.
As luck would have it, there's a veritable mountain of warriors' bodies right here. If I can just squeeze this bunch down inside me, I'll be a mighty warrior again in no time.
He's debatably not an evil being. Sure, his insides are filled with the remains of dead bodies instead of sunshine, rainbows and pudding, but he's not using his jar body to harm others, certainly not in the way that that ghost seemed to fear. So what's so scary about the jar? Well, not long after entering the jail, the contents of one of the jars spill out before you. A mass of pink oozing flesh sloughs off and somehow manages to stand. A wailing, limping creature with large tumorous growths struggles towards you. This is the horrifying reality of these jar innards. Their design reminds me of the abstract body horror seen in the Silent Hill games. Part symbolic, part horrifying dread, mixed in with a little bit of gut-wrenching pity. These beings gave me the same feeling. Upon closer inspection, you notice that these creatures have long, fair hair, are blindfolded, and bear a symbol on their foreheads. So what are these beings? The description of innard meat will start us off. Scraps of flesh fulfilling great jars. Rancorous spirits cling to the pinkish red, twitching meat. This is what becomes of the condemned, who get sliced up and stuffed into jars to become saints instead. These creatures were once people, cut up while still alive and forced into these jars. This is a far cry from what we saw in the base game, where jars like Alexander honoured the dead by collecting their bodies out of respect for their strength. Here in the Land of Shadow, this practice is entirely different, brutal and torturous, and the reference to becoming saints hints at something even darker. But first let's go to another location, the Whipping Hut, to learn more about who these victims are. Here you encounter yet another ghost, a horned figure standing menacingly over something no longer visible. For pity's sake, your place is in the jar. Nigh, sainthood itself awaits you within. For shamans like you, this is your lot. Life were you accorded for this alone. The spirit speaks to, presumably, a member of a shaman group, condemning them to a fate inside the containers. They are told that their purpose in life is to become saints, for their bodies to merge and transform within the jars. But the true horror about how this process would take place is revealed with an item you find just nearby. A whip bestrewn with rotting, misshapen teeth. Filthy and seething with disease, the teeth are embedded in the whip. As the wounds ripen, they grow inflamed and ooze pus. The flesh of shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others. This tooth whip reveals that the bodies of the shaman people possess a unique property, a fluid nature that allows them to combine with others. However, this ability was exploited in the most gruesome and painful way. From the ghost dialogue, it appears that the shamans were hunted, whipped and flogged until their bodies were infected, forcing them to merge within the jars. The concept of sainthood was touched on back in Belurat Jail by that ghost I mentioned at the beginning of the video. As it begged for its life, it does go on to say, "I swear a living saint I'll surely be. Please, you must forgive me, please." The idea of a living saint contrasts with traditional notions of sainthood. Usually it's only recognised after death. Typically, sainthood invokes a posthumous recognition of an individual's virtuous life that they led or the miraculous deeds that they did. Now, this spirit's plea reveals the desperation to avoid death, somehow bargaining that they can fulfill their purpose without being sacrificed, if that makes sense. We'll talk more about sainthood later, but for now, let me clarify how much of a grim existence that the shamans were forced to live. Near the whipping hut, where we found the method of torture, there is a place called Bonny Village. The name Bonny, meaning beautiful, is deeply ironic, as the village now is anything but. Once possibly a shaman settlement, it has now been overrun by a group known as the Greater Potentates, who have turned it into a simultaneous bloodbath and graveyard. As you explore Bonny Village, you are attacked by these strange hostile figures, completely unclothed except for a particular headdress and wielding a massive butcher's knife. And butcher is exactly what this instrument did. Weapon of the Greater Potentates of Bonny Village, an outsized butcher's cleaver used to dismember human bodies in the making of the great jars stored in the jails. Now, these people are insane, not just because of how they look, but also because they're not thinking properly due to what they're wearing on their heads. Grotesque masks constructed from countless solidified caterpillars, a ritual implement of the Greater Potentates of Bonny Village, used to ward off thoughts of impurity, doubt, temptation, and other wickednesses one is vulnerable to while absorbed in divine ritual. These masks are intended to clear the wearer's mind, allowing them to focus entirely on the ritualistic process of collecting and transforming people into saints. This is similar to how the Omen Killers made potions and physics that would rid themselves of human emotion in order to commit their heinous acts more effectively. However, I would argue that the Greater Potentates are not entirely free of wicked thoughts. They still seem to take some level of perverse pleasure in their violence. But interestingly, the mask that they wear is also worn by Hornsent, the relentless and single-minded character I talked about in my last video. His determination and unwavering purpose might partly be due to the effects of wearing the mask, which might hint that he too engaged in the disturbing ritual of the Greater Potentates. Also, their Bonny butchering knife is practically identical to the standard butchering knife from the base game, infamously wielded by the invader Anastasia, a knife-wielding ogress known for devouring countless tarnished while disguised as a finger maiden. This connection raises the possibility that Anastasia herself might have been a Greater Potentate, now continuing her gruesome practice, but this time with cannibalistic implications and in a different form. But this is entirely speculation, and they might not be related whatsoever, just mutual butcher knife enjoyers. So these shaman people were hunted notably by a group from Bonny Village and put into pots. But no ordinary pots. This hefty empty pot somehow mends itself when broken. The Greater Potentates of Bonny Village craft these and store them in a frozen jail. This line explains the cold jail we encountered earlier, which now we know this is probably so it can function like a giant freezer to preserve these unfortunate souls trapped within the pots. What is also disturbing about the actual pots is their magical ability to repair themselves if broken. It implies that even if someone trapped inside managed to crack the pot in an attempt to escape, the vessel would simply reseal itself, trapping them inside. Even more horrifying is the implication that these victims were still alive when sealed inside the pots, unimaginable suffering, but also starvation that drove them to extreme measures, as evidenced by the abundant amount of maggots found in the jars. Frozen maggots that somehow continue to wriggle, mainly found in jails. The maggots developed in great jar innards and are an invaluable source of sustenance to the prisoners. The idea that these prisoners trapped in dark, cold jars had to rely on larvae for sustenance, hatching from their own infected wounds, and those trapped with them, probably people they knew, is beyond grim. With their bodies fused by the skin-melding properties of their shaman flesh, they were perhaps rendered immobile, their forms melting and conforming to the shape of their jar prisons. This gruesome process seems to be part of the twisted goal of creating saints. This is further explored in the description of the Great Jar headpiece. The attire of the shamans who performed their worship at jails. They offered their prayers to the innards of the great jars, such that they might be reborn one day into sainthood. This is the cycle of death and rebirth, taken into the hands of mortal men. The description of this item is a little confusing. It does suggest that the shamans were not just the victims, but also participants in this grim process. They prayed over the jars, enabling those inside to reach some form of sainthood. However, you could also read this as they were desperately praying that the tortured souls of their people might finally be freed from their agony. Along those lines, it's possible that the shamans who were hunted for their flesh might have actually disguised themselves by wearing these large jars on their heads like a mask. It would have allowed them to travel through the prison unnoticed so that they could leave their respects in secret. Yet finding these headpieces within Belurat Jail suggests that some were eventually discovered and suffered the same fate as those they sought to honour. Another theory could be that the shaman's unique flesh was needed for the process, but so were their mystical powers, which might have been crucial in their conversion to saints. This would imply a very interesting duality of the shaman, both a victim and a ritual participant. Or none of the above could be true, and this might just be a localization choice. Perhaps the shamans referenced in the Great Jar description are not actually the same shamans as the ones hunted for their flesh. But let's explore the wider topic of what a shaman is and how they fit into the world of Elden Ring. Shamanism is widespread across many cultures, with variations in its practice, but at its core, shamanism revolves around healing, communicating with spirits, and serving as guides for souls to the otherworld. This is particularly interesting when we consider the Great Jar description, which speaks about shamans participating in a cycle of death and rebirth. In the base game, we get a glimpse of shamanic influences, specifically through the ancestral followers, whose attire includes pieces like the shaman leggings and furs. These followers embrace a classic shamanic image, donning horned animal-like appearances, playing mystical music made from bones, and worshipping the ancestor spirits. Although they are called ancestral followers and not shamans explicitly, their design and practices clearly draw from shamanic traditions, even if the literal word shaman only appears in 2 of the clothing descriptions. This brings us back to the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, where few references to shamans are scattered through dialogue and item descriptions. But where exactly do they appear in the Land of Shadow? Let's explore the Shaman Village. For those who haven't played Elden Ring, here's an unedited moment of what it feels like to enter this area for the first time, and a reminder for any of those wanting to relive it. After navigating through treacherous locations like the Black Keep, or surviving one of the numerous challenging boss fights in this area, you unexpectedly discover an entirely different atmosphere. The world goes silent. You hear nothing but the soft rustling, the breeze through a field of flowers. Birds flit by, and the area is bathed in a warm golden light. And yet, no one is here. A new soundtrack fades in, a simple melody of strings. If you listen closely, you may feel a faint recognition. The song is familiar, but something is missing. This tune is a simplified version of the music that plays when you first boot up the game and are in the main menu. But here, there is no booming of drums, no dramatic brass, no epic crescendo, just a few lonely, delicate notes repeating. This motif, also heard when you transition from the Radagon boss fight to Elden Beast, is regarded by some players as Marika's theme. Here in the Shaman Village, the final battle soundtrack is stripped of its orchestral layers and complexities to give a sense of emptiness and mystery. What happened here? As you step into the village, you soon find the source of the golden light, a small, glowing sapling. This is one of the critical clues to uncovering what happened to the Shamans and a significant connection between them and Queen Marika. Secret incantation of Queen Marika, only the kindness of gold, without order, creates a small, illusory Erdtree that continuously restores the HP of all nearby allies. Marika bathed the village of her home in gold, knowing full well that there was no one to heal. This incantation implies two significant things. First, the Shaman Village was once Marika's home, although not necessarily her birthplace, but somewhere that she resided for long enough to refer to it as such. And secondly, it suggests the fate of the Shamans. They were hunted and wiped out, leaving no one alive for Marika to save. When she returned to her home, she found an empty village, a people gone, so she left behind this illusory Erdtree, a symbolic gesture of respect, all while knowing it was too late. So could Marika have been a shaman herself? Seems possible. The villagers called her home, and she clearly felt a deep sorrow for the shaman's fate. Combined with what we know about the properties of shaman flesh, it would also give us a strong reasoning behind why Marika and Radagon are able to share the same body, something to do with Marika's shaman melding flesh, changing her form, and explaining why they were able to combine in the first place. Radagon, you have yet to become me. The other lore discovery here in the village supports this theory. As you explore the abandoned homes and ascend a small hill, you come across a gnarled, leafless tree that stands out. Upon closer inspection, you notice a robed figure nestled into the trunk. They have long hair, closed eyes, and open arms with palms forward, a welcoming, almost serene pose as the tree grows around them. At the base of this tree, you will find an item. A braid of golden hair cut loose. Queen Marika's offering to the Grand Mother. What was her prayer? Her wish? Her confession? There is no one left to answer, and Marika never returned home again. It appears that Marika cut off a part of her hair as an offering, likely to the figure referred to as the Grandmother. This moment is one we may never fully understand. However, considering the circumstances, her village was deserted, her people subjected to horrific torture for the simple fact of their birth, and her being the only one left, it's reasonable to believe this act held great significance for Marika. She likely solemnly vowed to honor, remember, and avenge those who had perished by cutting off her braid. As hair holds memories. Hair is constantly used to symbolize things like beginnings and endings, personal transformations, and the memories of these transitions. Renala gives hair to her sister, R'Lana, before their paths diverge. Millicent, who's facing infection and despair, ties up her hair to show her resolve. The change in hair colour during Marika's transformation from Radagon, and the duality of their identities, and of course, the curse of red hair that seems to follow their bloodline throughout the game. Marika was symbolically severing a part of herself by cutting off that braid, making a critical turning point in her life. What happened next and the precise order of events is purely up to interpretation and reading between the lines. However, it is clear that witnessing the suffering of the shaman people is probably the main reason that motivated Marika's desire for revenge. The shamans were explicitly targeted as a group, so Marika ordered her son Mesmer to purge the Tower Folk, as Leda describes it. The Tower Folk are the Hornsent, who were building a massive tower in Belurat, hoping to reach the heavens. Check out my last video for more on this and their culture. Given the brutal treatment of the shaman people specifically, it raises this question: were their bodies used in the building of this great construct? Shamans, viewed with the potential to become saints with miraculous powers, were killed to enable the granting of godhood to those who sought to ascend through the gate. The location of Belurat Jail, directly beneath the city where the tower was being built, is telling. The pulley system with jars, the cold storage of the jails to preserve the jar innards, and the chains used to raise and lower them all point to this grim reality. When the tower itself is finally revealed, you can see the shapes of people embedded within the structure itself. This is the same gateway we saw in the Shadow of the Erdtree trailer, where Marika ascends the steps. The difference, however, is the blood-soaked appearance of the gateway. It's fresher, more visceral compared to the petrified nature of the gate you later find in the story. When Marika visited it, driven by her thirst for revenge, the horrors were still fresh, and the wound to her people remained painfully raw, quite literally. That's just my interpretation of the events based on what we see in the trailer, the game, and the state of different DLC areas. Let me know if you interpreted these events differently. One significant detail I haven't mentioned yet is the mark on the foreheads of the living jar innards. This symbol doesn't immediately stand out as something we've seen before. Still, it could be a combination of pre-existing symbols or a new one designed to evoke a certain feeling, especially of familiarity. There are several theories about what this mark could mean. Some suggest it could be related to Marika's rune, the rune seen in Radagon's Source Seal and Scar Seal, or even the Rune of Death, or perhaps just the upper portion of the Elden Ring itself. It may be any combination of these, but regardless of its meaning, this specific combination of patterns is only found on the foreheads of these living jar innards. So was this symbol a way to designate those used in the pot ritual, akin to branding cattle, or was it something tied to the shamans themselves, like war paint? Earlier I mentioned the ancestral followers, and while I don't believe they are directly linked to the shamans from the DLC, their practices may have similarities. They too have forehead markings, though theirs resemble paint, where the jar innards markings seem more like carvings or burns. A crucial point that might shed more light on this is Marika's own forehead. Isn't it interesting that her forehead is obscured in most of her depictions? Whether she's hanging her head or her hair or crown is covering her forehead, we rarely get a clear view. If we could confirm she has a similar mark, it would clarify whether this was a shaman tradition or something linked to the pot ritual. However, there is one instance where we see a bit more of her forehead during Rani's ending. As Rani picks up Marika's stone-like head, there doesn't seem to be any mark from what we can see. However, this isn't the most natural of Marika's forms. She has a statue-like appearance here, likely due to her attempt to shatter herself. This stony texture may now hide the marking, just like how markings aren't visible on her statues. It's just a little theory of mine, but it could explain why we haven't seen this symbol on her. What seems clear to me is that the Hornsent was so fixated on building their divine tower to reach the heavens that they were willing to commit horrific atrocities to achieve their vision. Their relentless ambition was a driving force that resulted in tremendous suffering, and the mark that these rituals left on the inhabitants of the world, much like the mark on the forehead of the jar innards. There is one example of someone from Bonny Village who expressed disgust at this practice, and that is the author of the Potentate cookbooks scattered across the Land of Shadow. The cookbook description reads, "A record of crafting techniques of the Greater Potentate who roamed lands near and far. Haunted by the grotesque practice of his village of birth, he stuffed great pots with all manner of things." Interestingly, most of the recipes in these cookbooks involve combining ingredients in pots, but they use mushrooms instead of people. It might sound odd, but this individual was so disturbed by the atrocities of their people that they found an alternative, vegan pots, if you will. Even the mushrooms description supports this. The flesh of the mushroom is similar to raw meat and can serve as pot innards. Despite this one person's moral stand, the greater group persisted in their grotesque practices, which led to the near-total annihilation of the shamans. Marika, who seemed to be the last surviving shaman who hadn't been killed or imprisoned, understandably sought vengeance for what happened to her people. However, Marika's decision to cleanse the land of all horn scent in retaliation is troubling, especially when innocents were likely caught in the crossfire. The ex-potentate author, for example, seemed to have no part in the unethical practices, yet probably became a casualty of Marika's crusade. Her overgeneralization and decision to punish all horn scent regardless of individual guilt is precisely what the phrase "two wrongs don't make a right" is meant to teach. Do I agree with what Marika did? Absolutely not. Do I understand the motivation behind her actions? Yes, I do. This DLC adds significant depth to Marika's character. In the base game, she was portrayed as someone waging endless war with a particular vendetta against the Omens, leaving us wondering what on earth her issue was. Now it makes more sense. The sight of horns likely triggered traumatic memories of the suffering and loss she experienced back at home. Her actions, while still reprehensible, are now much more contextualized, shaped by her grief. Some people view her as a victim of circumstance, driven to violence by the injustice her people faced. Others condemn her for the atrocities she committed, regardless of her motivations, but I think she can totally be both a victim and a villain. This is why the Shaman Village is such a compelling location in the DLC. It reveals Marika's humble beginnings, a place of peace and tranquility that stands in stark contrast to the corrupt and powerful figure she became until she was imprisoned in the Erdtree, where you find her at the end of the game. Despite all she did, she too became a vessel for someone else's ascension. But those are just some of my thoughts on Marika and the new lore we've gained from the DLC. I'm always open to hearing different interpretations in my comments section, so feel free to share yours. And just to be clear, genocide is wrong. It feels odd that I even have to say that, but you'd be surprised, especially recently in this community. That said, please keep it civil and respectful, folks. Now I'd like to discuss one last concept regarding jars and pots. The living jars we encounter in the base game, and a common question, are they the same as the jars found in the DLC? Well, yes and no. According to a talisman in the base game, though the jars are brought to life by human flesh and blood, they are rather kindly folk. Perhaps they were made to be better than their innards. This description confirms that the living jars are animated because of the human flesh inside of them, which explains why they move, talk, and even have little pot arms and legs, complete with their own consciousness. Stuffing them with the right materials seems to imbue them with sentience, but the line about them being made to be better than their innards feels like a commentary on that the people inside of them weren't exactly good. Could this be referring to the shamans, the Hornset, or another group that was also forced into the jars? It is theorized that while shamans were the catalyst in this process, they weren't the only ones being used. We do see a lot of horned ghosts and figures and corpses in places related to the jar ritual. Key point is that stuffing jars with human remains seem to animate them somehow, and the result could be benevolent pot friends, corroborated by the existence of Alexander and Jarburg. Speaking of Alexander, at the end of his quest to become a great warrior, he challenges you to a duel, the result deciding the best warrior. And because he fails, he gives you his innards as a tradition to pass on his accrued collection. And because he fails, he has to pass on his innards to you as a tradition to keep the collection alive. Found at the core of the dead flesh that once filled the great jar. The jar contains dregs inherited from those who came before. Thus our warriors passed from jar to jar, carrying dreams of greatness. This reveals something important. The phrase "those who came before" actually links to the figures of the Hornsent, as they firmly believe that they are the original inhabitants of the Land of Shadow. We see this exact same term, "those who came before," and it's used to talk about higher figures of the Hornsent. Alexander's innards hint that his pot body, and probably other jars, contain flesh from these people, implying that they've been passing down their essence through jars for such a long time, originally starting with those from the Land of Shadow. It suggests that these jars survived the pre-DLC events and continue the practice of transforming their legacy from jar to jar into the base game. However, the first line also says it is dead flesh, which specifies that these jars do not have living insides like those in Belurat and Bonny Jail. And finally, fragments of the living jars in the base game say that such fragments commanded a high price due to the magical power locked within. This leaves the living jars unfortunate targets, poachers. The magical power within could be related to the flesh of the shamans or the jars themselves. Sadly, this does suggest that even after being animated, the living jars do remain a target, hunted for their power within the fragments. Once again, the cycle of life, death and exploitation, the jars and their ancestors hunted to be put into pots and then hunted thereafter. But let's end this on a more positive note. Let's talk about Jarburg, a haven for the living jars. This small village filled with flowers feels like a secluded sanctuary. Its peaceful ambience is a visual and thematic parallel to the Shaman Village. The most fascinating detail comes from Jarburg, the adorable talking jar, who mentions that the village needs a potentate, a caretaker for the jars. In the base game, this term was somewhat mysterious, with Jarburg describing the potentate as someone with soft, silky hands that feel nice when patting the jars. With the release of the DLC, we were introduced to the Greater Potentates, who turned out to be the exact opposite of what jars and Jarburg were looking for. These potentates were hunters of the jars. They even wield a butcher knife with a weapon skill that sharpens the blade. An unsettling visual where it appears they might be using the palms of their hands to sharpen the knife, which suggests that their hands are so rough and worn that they function like whetstones. This is completely opposite to the soft, gentle hands that the jars of Jarburg desire from their potentates. This is why it's so significant that Diallos finds his way to Jarburg. Completing his long, tragic quest, Diallos finally dedicates himself to caring for the jars. Jarburg even remarks on Diallos' soft hands, saying they're perfect for being a potentate. But looking back now with the new DLC lore, Diallos' story takes on an even greater meaning now. At the end of his quest, Diallos sacrifices himself to protect Jarburg from poachers, jars once again being hunted, just like the shamans were in their peaceful village. And here's the kicker. Diallos drops a Numen rune when he dies. This detail always was a bit of a mystery, as there wasn't really any indication up until this point that Diallos had any connection to the Numen. But now with the DLC's connection to the Numen race, Marika and the Shamans, the fact that Marika herself was a Numen, this connection seems far more intentional. Diallos was born to protect the jars, just as Marika sought to defend her village. Both are Numen, and both must protect the jars. Or perhaps Diallos found this Numen rune within one of the jars, confirming that they are filled with Numen people, aka the Shaman people. It's It's a subtle but powerful link between these two seemingly unrelated characters, and both in the end making sacrifices for the better or worse of their people. Thank you so much for watching this video, everyone. I hope this link didn't freak any new viewers out too much. I do wonder that whenever I think about someone tuning into my channel for the first time and seeing whatever the hell this is. This video is technically a part 2 to a video I did before on the Horn Scent, so if you want to check out their side of things and their history, I recommend you check out that video as well. Thank you everyone for supporting me and giving me suggestions about what I should cosplay and talk about next, and a special thank you to my channel members and patrons.